On the morning of January 31st, 1943, in the basement of a ruined department store on the Volga River, the newest field marshal in the German army surrendered to a Soviet lieutenant. His name was Friedrich Paulus. He had been a field marshal for less than 1 day. Above his head, stretching for miles along the frozen river, lay a city that barely resembled a city anymore. Most of its housing had been destroyed or rendered uninhabitable, and yet the side that held this frozen wasteland had just won what many historians call one of the most consequential battles of the 20th century. This city has carried 3 names: Tsaritsyn, the fortress; Stalingrad, the battlefield; Volgograd, the survivor. It has been attacked, burned, renamed, and rebuilt, again and again, for over 400 years. This is not just the story of a battle. It is the story of how a remote outpost on a bend of the Volga River became the place where Hitler's war broke, and what a city does after the world's attention moves on. Let's go back to where it started. Chapter 1. The Fortress on the Volga. Imagine you are standing on the west bank of a river, so wide that the far shore is a thin grey line on the horizon. It is the summer of 1589. Behind you, dry grassland rolls away toward the sunset, flat and open and utterly exposed. In front of you, the Volga moves south toward the Caspian Sea, the longest river in Europe, carrying more water than any other river on the continent. There is no city here. There is only wind, grass, water, and a small group of Russian soldiers unloading timber from boats. They are about to build a fort at the edge of the known world, and the reason they are building it here, on this exact bend of this exact river, is the same reason that armies will still be killing each other over this exact ground 350 years later. To understand why, you have to look at a map the way a 16th century Russian strategist looked at it. For centuries, the Volga had not been a Russian river. Its lower reaches belonged to the successors of the Mongol Empire, the Tatar Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan, and the grasslands around it belonged to nomadic peoples who raided, traded, and answered to no czar. Then, in the 1550s, Ivan IV, the man history remembers as Ivan the Terrible, conquered Kazan and then Astrakhan. In the space of 4 years, Moscow suddenly controlled a river highway running all the way from the Russian heartland to the Caspian Sea, and through the Caspian, to the silk and spices of Persia and Central Asia. There was just one problem. Owning a river on paper is not the same as controlling it in reality. The lower Volga in the 1580s was, to put it plainly, lawless. Nogai horsemen crossed it to raid Russian settlements. Crimean Tatars pushed in from the west, and Russian river pirates, many of them runaway peasants who called themselves Cossacks, robbed the merchant convoys of the very Tsar they nominally served. Trade caravans on the Volga needed armed escorts numbering in the hundreds, and even that was sometimes not enough. Persian and Bukharan envoys complained to Moscow that the river route was too dangerous to use. So Moscow did what states have always done when a valuable route becomes ungovernable. It built a chain of fortresses: Samara in 1586, Tsaritsyn in 1589, Saratov in 1590. 3 wooden forts, spaced along the great river like streetlights along a dark road. The man who oversaw this work was a military governor named Grigory Zasykin, a prince from an old but impoverished family who had spent his career on Russia's most dangerous frontiers. He is not a famous name, even in Russia, but he chose ground so well that 2 of his 3 fortress sites grew into cities of over 1 million people. Whatever they were paying him, it was not enough. The site he chose for Tsaritsyn was special for one reason above all others, and this is the single most important geographic fact in this entire story, so it is worth slowing down for. At this point on the map, the Volga, flowing southeast, comes within about 40 miles of the Don, the other great river of southern Russia, which flows southwest toward the Black Sea, 2 of the most important waterways in Eurasia, running in opposite directions toward 2 different seas. Nearly touch each other here. Whoever holds this narrow neck of land holds the crossing point between 2 worlds. In the 16th century, that meant controlling trade. In 1942, it would mean something much bigger. When you hear later in this story that Hitler's armies were ordered to reach the Volga at this precise spot, keep this image in mind. They were obeying the same logic of geography that Grigory Zasykin obeyed in 1589. The map had not changed, only the stakes had. The first official mention of the fortress appears in a royal charter dated July 2nd, 1589, which is the date the modern city still celebrates as its birthday. The earliest fort may actually have stood on an island in the river before being moved to the west bank, though the records from those first years are thin, and historians still debate the details. Even the name tells you this was frontier country. Tsaritsyn sounds like it should honor a Tsaritsa, a Russian empress. It almost certainly does not. The most widely accepted explanation is that it comes from Turkic words meaning something like yellow water or yellow island, describing the silty local river that flowed into the Volga here. The Russians heard a foreign name and bent it into a familiar shape, a Turkic name wearing Russian clothing, on a fort built to hold land that had belonged to other peoples within living memory. Cities, like people, do not get to choose the circumstances of their birth. Life in early Tsaritsyn was brutally simple. A wooden stockade, watchtowers, a garrison of perhaps a few hundred musketeers, the Streltsy, serving rotations at a post where the summer heat cracked the earth and the winter wind came off the steppe with nothing to slow it down for hundreds of miles. Their job was to watch the river, escort the caravans, and survive. The fort burned and was rebuilt more than once in its first decades, a pattern the city would never really escape. And here is the thing about Tsaritsyn that separates it from a city like Paris or London or Rome. Those cities were born as markets or crossings and only later learned war. Tsaritsyn was born a soldier. It existed for one purpose: to project armed force over a contested landscape. And everything else. The trade, the fishing, the town that slowly grew inside and around the walls, came afterward. Violence was not something that happened to this city. Violence was its founding industry. Moscow built Tsaritsyn to bring order to the wild southern frontier, but for its first 2 centuries, the fortress would fail at that job in the most spectacular ways imaginable. The greatest dangers on the lower Volga did not come from the Tatars or the Nogai horsemen the fort had been built to watch. They came from within Russia itself. Twice, armies of the poor and the furious would rise out of these grasslands, led by men whose names still carry an electric charge in Russian. And both times, Tsaritsyn would be at the center of the storm. The first of those men was a Cossack captain named Stepan Razin, and when his fleet appeared on the river below the city walls in 1670, the garrison of Tsaritsyn did something no one in Moscow expected. They opened the gates. Chapter 2: Rebels and Fire. Stepan Razin was the kind of man that empires create by accident. He was born around 1630 into the world of the Don Cossacks. the free warrior communities that lived along the rivers south of Muscovy. The Cossacks were a paradox the Russian state never fully solved. They were runaway serfs and frontier fighters who bowed to no landlord. Yet Moscow needed them to guard its borders. So it paid them, armed them, and pretended not to notice what they did in their spare time. What they did in their spare time, quite often, was piracy. Razin began as a raider in the classic style, leading expeditions down the Volga and across the Caspian to plunder Persian shipping. But somewhere in the late 1660s, plunder turned into politics. Razin began declaring that he was not fighting for treasure. He was fighting against the boyars, the nobles, the officials who were grinding the common people of Russia into serfdom. He announced that everywhere his army went, serfs would be free, to an empire built on the bonded labor of millions. No message could have been more explosive. In 1670, Razin turned his fleet up the Volga toward the heartland of Russia, and the first major fortress in his path was Tsaritsyn. What happened next tells you everything about whose side the frontier was really on. The garrison of Tsaritsyn did not fight Razin. The townspeople and many of the soldiers opened the gates and welcomed him in. The military governor, a man named Timofey Turgenev, tried to hold out in a tower with a handful of loyalists. He was dragged out and drowned in the Volga. The fortress that Moscow had built to control the river had just joined the river's rebellion. For a few extraordinary months, the revolt looked unstoppable. City after city along the Volga fell or defected, and the uprising swelled with peasants, boatmen, and members of the Volga's non-Russian peoples. But rebel armies made of the poor and the angry rarely beat professional soldiers in open battle, and outside the fortress of Simbirsk that autumn, Razin's host was shattered, wounded. He fled back to the Don, where the loyalist Cossack elders, choosing their own survival over solidarity, seized him and handed him to Moscow. In June of 1671, Stepan Razin was publicly quartered in Red Square. He is said to have stayed silent through the entire execution. The state took its revenge on the rebel lands, and contemporaries described mass executions along the Volga on a horrifying scale. But killing Razin did not kill Razin. He passed almost immediately into folklore, into songs that Russian boatmen sang for the next 2.5 centuries. The state had won the war and lost the story, and losing the story mattered, because Russia's rulers never actually fixed the thing that had made men follow Razin in the first place. Which is why, almost exactly 100 years later, it all happened again, on a bigger scale, closer to the walls of Tsaritsyn, and this time led by a man who claimed to be the Tsar himself. His name was Emelian Pugachev, and like Razin he was a Don Cossack, born, remarkably, in the same region that had produced Razin. In 1773, during the reign of Catherine the Great, Pugachev declared that he was Peter III, Catherine's dead husband, miraculously survived and returned to give the common people their freedom. It says something profound about 18th century Russia that this claim worked. Serfs, Cossacks, factory labourers, and the Bashkir and Tatar peoples of the frontier rose by the tens of thousands. At its height, the rebellion controlled a huge territory and shook the empire badly enough that Catherine's government at first tried to keep news of it from spreading. In August of 1774, Pugachev's army arrived at Tsaritsyn, fresh from burning and looting its way down the Volga, but this time the gates stayed shut. The fortress had been rebuilt and strengthened over the previous decades, with a defensive line stretching across the neck of land between the Volga and the Don, and the garrison held. Tsaritsyn became one of the very few Volga strongholds that Pugachev failed to take. Days later, government troops caught his army just south of the city and destroyed it. Like Raisin, Pugachev was betrayed by his own men, delivered to the state in a cage, and executed in Moscow in January of 1775. Catherine the Great then did something that tells you how deeply these revolts had frightened the crown. She tried to erase the memory itself. Pugachev's home village was renamed. His house was ordered destroyed. Even the river Yaik, cradle of the revolt, was renamed the Ural, so that its very name would disappear from the map. Hold on to that move, because it is the oldest habit in Russian politics. A government, badly shaken, reaching for the map and changing names to control how the past is remembered. This story will see it happen twice more, and both times the city on the Volga will be the page the state writes on. For Tsaritsyn itself, the two great revolts fixed its character. Twice the storm had come. Once the city had joined it. Once the city had held against it. And both times the grasslands around it had run with blood. It was now, unquestionably, a loyal fortress of the Russian state. But by the early 1800s, the frontier had moved hundreds of miles south. The raiders were gone, and a fortress with no one left to fight is just a poor town in the middle of nowhere. Travellers of that era passed through a drowsy settlement of wooden houses and dust, and saw nothing worth writing home about. The fortress had outlived its purpose. The town would have to become something else entirely. And the thing that transformed it was not a general or a tsar. It was a machine. Chapter 3. The Chicago of the Volga. In 1862, a locomotive pulled out of Tsaritsyn heading west, along a brand new rail line that ran across the 40-mile neck of land between the Volga and the Don. It was a short, unglamorous railroad in the middle of an enormous, empty country. It was also one of those pieces of infrastructure that looks small on a map and turns out to move history. For centuries, cargo moving between the Volga world and the Don world had been hauled across that gap by ox cart and camel, slowly and expensively. Now, for the first time, goods could flow between the Caspian and the Black Sea without a detour of hundreds of miles. The door between the two rivers, the door that Grigory Zasakin had been sent to guard in 1589, had finally been propped open by steam and iron. More lines followed, linking the town to Moscow and to the Donbass coalfields, and Tsaritsyn found itself transformed from a backwater into one of the great transshipment points of the Russian Empire. What happened next is best understood through an American lens, because Americans had just watched the same story happen at home. In the 1830s, Chicago was a muddy village of a few hundred people beside a lake. Then the railroads arrived, and within 2 generations it was one of the largest cities on earth, a roaring machine of grain, lumber, and slaughterhouses. Tsaritsyn was Russia running the Chicago experiment, a nothing town in flat, empty country, placed at the exact point where waterways and railways crossed, suddenly inhaling people and industry at a rate no one could plan for. The population, only a few thousand at mid-century, climbed to around 100,000 by 1900 and kept climbing, roughly doubling again by the eve of the First World War. 3 products built the new Tsaritsyn, and each one matters to where this story is going. The first was wood. Timber rafted down the Volga from the forests of the north was hauled out at Tsaritsyn, milled, and shipped by rail to the treeless coal country of the Donbass and the steppe farms of the south. The city became one of the largest timber processing centers in Russia, its riverfront lined for miles, with sawmills and lumber yards. The second was fish. The lower Volga and the Caspian produced astonishing quantities of it, and Tsaritsyn became a hub where the catch was salted, packed, and loaded onto trains for the cities of central Russia. The third product was the one that pointed toward the future, and toward the catastrophe this story is moving toward: oil. In the late 19th century, the oil fields of Baku on the Caspian Sea were among the most productive on the planet, at times rivaling the output of the United States. Much of that oil traveled north by tanker up the Volga, and Tsaritsyn became one of its great transfer stations, with sprawling tank farms and, by the early 20th century, some of the empire's pioneering oil processing facilities. The Nobel family, the same family whose fortune funds the Nobel Prizes, built a major operation here, complete with its own company town for workers. Mark that fact well. As early as the 1880s, this city's fate was already tied to a single geographic truth. The oil of the Caspian moved to the heart of Russia along the Volga, and Tsaritsyn sat on the artery. 60 years later, a man in Berlin would stare at that same artery on a map and reach the conclusion that would kill 1 million people. Heavy industry followed the cargo. In 1898, French investors opened a massive metallurgical plant on the northern edge of the city, a complex that would one day be known as Red October, a name that will return in this story under gunfire. Gun carriage works and an artillery plant followed. By 1914, Tsaritsyn was not just moving the empire's goods, it was forging its weapons. But if the city's economy looked like Chicago, its living conditions looked like something out of a novel nobody would dare publish. Boomtown Tsaritsyn was, by most contemporary accounts, one of the harshest urban environments in European Russia. Workers lived in overcrowded barracks and dugouts near the factories. Cholera and typhus swept through regularly. The dust of the steppe mixed with soot from the mills. The city had grown 50 times over in 2 generations. And its schools, hospitals, sewers, and civic institutions had not come close to keeping up. It was a city of young, uprooted, exhausted men, far from their villages, with no property, no vote that mattered, and no reason to love the system they worked for. Think back to Razin, and to what happens on the lower Volga when enough desperate people conclude that the arrangement above them is unjust. By the early 1900s, Tsaritsyn had quietly become exactly what it had been in 1670. Dry grass waiting for a spark. Except now the dry grass worked in factories, and the factories made cannons. In 1914, the empire went to war. In 1917, the empire collapsed. And in the civil war that followed, the armies converging on this remote industrial city would include a 39-year-old Bolshevik official from Georgia, a man almost nobody outside the party had heard of, whose time in Tsaritsyn would bind his name to the city forever. His name was Joseph Stalin. Chapter 4. The City That Took Stalin's Name. In June of 1918, a special train arrived at the Tsaritsyn station carrying a Georgian revolutionary with a pockmarked face, an armed escort, and a job title that sounded almost comically boring. Joseph Stalin had been sent south as Director General of Food Supplies for southern Russia. He was 39 years old, known inside the Bolshevik Party as a capable organizer, and nearly invisible outside it. His assignment was to get grain moving north to the starving red cities. What he actually did was seize control of the entire military situation. To see why this remote posting became the launching pad of the 20th century's most infamous dictator, you have to see what Russia was that summer. Russia was no longer a country. It was a collapsing star. The Tsar had abdicated in 1917. The Bolsheviks had seized power in October of that year, and by the following summer, the old empire had shattered into a civil war being fought across 11 time zones, reds against whites, with dozens of smaller armies, nationalist movements, and foreign expeditions swirling through the wreckage. In that war, a handful of places mattered far more than their size suggested, and Tsaritsyn was one of them. Look at the map through Bolshevik eyes and you see why. The Reds held the center of Russia, Moscow and Petrograd, a huge population with dangerously little food. The grain was in the south, in the Kuban and the North Caucasus. The oil was in Baku, and nearly all of it moved north along one artery, the Volga, through one city, Tsaritsyn. Meanwhile, the white general Pyotr Krasnov and his Don Cossack army were pushing toward the city from the west. If Tsaritsyn fell, the whites of the south could link up with the anti-Bolshevik forces to the east, and the red heartland would be cut off from its food and fuel. The city was the hinge holding the southern front together. Within weeks of arriving, Stalin was signing orders on military matters he had no formal authority over, purging the local command of former Tsarist officers, and feuding openly with Leon Trotsky, the head of the Red Army, who insisted those ex-Tsarist specialists were essential to winning the war. Stalin had a number of them arrested, and accounts from the period describe suspected counter-revolutionaries being held on a barge on the Volga, with executions carried out on his watch. The methods that would later terrify an entire superpower were already visible in miniature, in this one city. In 1918, here is where the history gets layered, and the layers are worth separating carefully. The city held. Krasnov's Cossacks besieged Tsaritsyn 3 times between the summer of 1918 and early 1919, and 3 times the Red defense threw them back, at horrific cost. That much is fact. What came later was myth. After Stalin achieved absolute power, Soviet propaganda rebuilt the defense of Tsaritsyn into his personal epic. The moment a military genius saved the revolution, inconvenient details, like the fact that the city actually did fall to a different white army for several months in 1919, after Stalin had left, were quietly sanded away. Modern historians generally credit the successful defense far more to the ferocity of the local workers, the 10th Red Army, and commanders like Kliment Voroshilov, than to Stalin's disputed leadership. But in a dictatorship, the past belongs to the winner, and in April of 1925, the winner collected. Lenin had died the year before. Stalin was consolidating his grip on the party, and the city of Tsaritsyn was officially renamed Stalingrad, Stalin City. Pause on what that name actually did, because this is the moment the trap is set. A Tsar's fortress had become a dictator's namesake. From 1925 onward, this city was no longer just a dot on the map. It was a claim, a boast, a piece of one man's ego cast in brick and iron on the bank of the Volga. Cities with ordinary names can be evacuated, traded, surrendered when the military logic demands it. A city called Stalingrad could never be just ground, not to the man it was named for, and one day, not to his enemy either. The new Stalingrad became a showcase. When Stalin launched his brutal crash industrialization of the Soviet Union in 1928, the city on the Volga was pushed to the front of it. The Stalingrad tractor plant, built at staggering speed with American engineering help, plans drawn by the Albert Kahn firm of Detroit, equipment shipped from the United States, opened in 1930 and was celebrated as proof that the Soviet future was arriving. The Red October steelworks and the Barricade armaments factory expanded beside it, forming a chain of industrial giants stretching for miles along the river. The tractor plant, naturally, could also build tanks. By 1940, Stalingrad held close to 500,000 people and ranked among the great industrial centers of the Soviet Union. A long ribbon of factories, workers' settlements, and new white apartment blocks stretched along the west bank of the Volga. Propaganda posters presented it as the model socialist city, young, modern, muscular, and loyal. On summer evenings, families strolled the new embankment above the river. Couples went dancing. Children swam in the Volga below the bluffs. The war, when it came in June of 1941, was far away at first, a thing that happened on the radio, 1,000 miles to the west. It stayed far away for almost exactly 1 year. Chapter 5. Why Hitler Came. In the summer of 1942, in his forward headquarters in Ukraine, Adolf Hitler stood over a map of southern Russia and told his generals, in words recorded in multiple accounts from those briefings, that if he did not get the oil of the Caucasus, he would have to end the war. For once, the dictator's rhetoric matched the actual arithmetic. Germany ran its war machine largely on Romanian oil fields and synthetic fuel squeezed out of coal. And it was not enough. Hitler's own planners had warned that fuel shortages could strangle the entire war effort. Meanwhile, on the far side of the Black Sea, the Soviet Caucasus was producing the great majority of the Soviet Union's oil, with Baku alone accounting for the largest share. That was the prize. Everything else, including the city this video is about, was originally a detail. There was also unfinished business. The previous year, Germany had invaded the Soviet Union, expecting a collapse in weeks, and had instead been stopped, frozen, and bloodied outside Moscow. The gambler had lost a hand but not the table, and in the spring of 1942 he still held real advantages in the south. So the new plan, laid out in Hitler's Directive Number 41 in April 1942 and code-named Case Blue, abandoned the idea of attacking everywhere at once. Everything would be thrown into southern Russia. The armies would drive east, seize the oil of the Caucasus, and cut the Volga, severing the artery that carried that oil north into the Soviet heartland. Now read the fine print of that plan, because it contains one of the great ironies of the 20th century. In the original directive, Stalingrad was not the prize. The text called for reaching the city, or at least bringing it under fire of heavy weapons, so that it would cease to function as an industrial and transport center. In plain language, wreck the factories, block the river, move on. The oil was the point. The city was a task on a checklist. For the first weeks that summer, Case Blue looked like 1941 all over again. German spearheads raced across the open steppe, and Hitler, watching the map, became convinced the Soviets were finished. What actually seems to have been happening, as historians of the campaign such as David Glantz have documented, is that the Red Army was for once trading space for survival, pulling units back before they could be surrounded. Hitler read the empty steppe as victory, and in July, flush with that false confidence, he made a decision that sharpened a contradiction already built into the campaign. He split his forces to pursue both objectives at once. Army Group A would turn south into the Caucasus for the oil. Army Group B, with the 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus as its spearhead, would head east, toward the city on the Volga. 2 offensives, diverging at nearly a right angle, sharing supply lines that already stretched over hundreds of miles of grassland. Germany's own chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder, filled his diary that summer with increasingly desperate complaints, writing that Hitler's decisions were driven by mood and that the dictator was chronically underestimating the enemy. By September, Halder had been fired for saying such things out loud, and here is where the city's name begins to warp the story. What military logic required at Stalingrad, wrecking a transport hub, could, in theory, have been accomplished the way the directive originally described, with bombers and artillery. But as Soviet resistance stiffened through August and September, the operation mutated, taking Stalingrad, house by house if necessary, became first a fixation and then, in Hitler's own public words, a promise. In a Munich speech that autumn he declared that he was already master of the city and that no one would push him back out of it. Historians still argue about how much the name itself, Stalin's city, drew Hitler forward, and it would be too simple to reduce the battle to a duel of egos over a word. But this much is documented fact. A dictator who had publicly staked his prestige on that specific name lost the ability to walk away from it, and on the other side of the map, the man the city was named for showed no intention of letting it go either. The Soviet side had its own iron logic. In July 1942, with the South collapsing, Stalin issued Order No. 227, the document every Russian schoolchild still knows by its refrain: not one step back. It created punishment battalions and blocking detachments and made unauthorized retreat a crime, whatever else that order was. And it was many brutal things. It was an announcement that the trading of space for time was over. Somewhere, the Red Army would turn and stand. Geography and symbolism had already chosen the spot. So by late August of 1942, 2 enormous armies were converging on a 15-mile ribbon of factories and apartment blocks along the west bank of the Volga, in what would grow into one of the largest and deadliest battles in human history. Inside that ribbon lived roughly 500,000 people, plus a flood of refugees from the west, and the city had not been seriously evacuated. The 6th Army's columns were close enough that German officers could see the white apartment towers through their field glasses. The people in those towers were watering gardens, riding trams, going to the cinema. Sunday, August 23rd, 1942, began in Stalingrad as a hot, cloudless summer morning. It would end as the most terrible single day in the city's 400-year history. Chapter 6. August 23rd. Every city that suffers a catastrophe has a last normal morning. For Stalingrad, it was Sunday, August 23rd, 1942. The day was hot and clear. The trams were running. The city was still packed with civilians, its own population swollen by refugees who had fled east ahead of the German advance. Why so many people were still there is a question historians have examined ever since, and the honest answer is that the evacuation was delayed and incomplete for a tangle of reasons: military, industrial, logistical, and political. Factory workers were held at their benches under wartime discipline, because the tanks they built were needed at the front. River transport was consumed by military traffic, and some accounts attribute part of the delay to Stalin's own reluctance, including the belief, reported in several histories of the battle, that the army would fight harder for a living city than for an empty one, whatever the exact weight of each cause. The result was arithmetic of the cruelest kind. When the storm arrived, the people were still inside it. The storm arrived twice on the same day, from two directions at once. First came the tanks. At dawn, the 16th Panzer Division broke out of the German bridgehead on the Don and drove east across the open steppe, covering the roughly 40-mile gap between the rivers in a single day. That 40-mile neck of land, the corridor that had made this city matter since 1589, was crossed in hours. By late afternoon, German tank crews reached the high west bank of the Volga just north of the city, at the suburb of Rhinock, and stood looking down at the great river that Hitler had ordered cut. Photographs taken by the crews that evening show grinning young men pointing at the water. They had reached the eastern edge of the map. Most of them would never leave it. On the way, they ran into something no invading army expects. The anti-aircraft guns defending the northern factories were crewed in large part by young women, many of them barely out of school, trained to shoot at airplanes. When the panzers appeared, the crews lowered their barrels and fired at tanks instead. Accounts of the action, including those collected by the historian Antony Beevor, describe the batteries fighting until they were destroyed, gun by gun. German officers who inspected the positions afterward recorded their shock at discovering who had been firing at them. It was the first lesson of Stalingrad, delivered on the first day. This city was not going to follow the script. Then, while the tanks rolled, the sky filled. Beginning that afternoon and continuing in waves for days, the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet carried out one of the heaviest aerial bombardments yet seen in the war. Hundreds of bombers flying wave after wave of sorties over the city. There was nothing precise about it. High explosive bombs shattered the apartment blocks. Incendiaries set the wooden districts alight. Along the riverbank, the oil storage tanks ruptured and burned, and survivors described patches of blazing fuel spreading across the surface of the water itself, so that to the people watching from the far bank, the Volga appeared to be on fire. A column of black smoke stood over the city, visible for miles, and ash fell like grey snow on the steppe. No one knows exactly how many people died in that bombing, and it is important to say so plainly. Older Soviet-era accounts commonly claimed around 40,000 dead in the first days. Some later historians, re-examining the evidence, have argued the true figure may have been lower, while still counting in the thousands or tens of thousands. What is beyond dispute is that it was a massacre of civilians, that the city's centre was reduced to a burning shell in less than a week, and that August 23rd is still commemorated in the city today as its darkest single day. And now comes the twist that shapes everything that follows, one of the grimmest ironies in the history of warfare. The Luftwaffe had done its job too well. A city of stone and timber had been converted into a landscape of collapsed masonry, cratered streets, cellars, and twisted steel. Tanks cannot sweep through rubble. Dive bombers cannot find targets in it. Artillery just rearranges it. But infantry can hide in it, tunnel through it, and defend every heap of it. The Germans had spent the summer perfecting fast, open field warfare, and on August 23rd they demolished the one kind of terrain where that style worked. They had, in effect, built the fortress they would spend the next 5 months dying in. In the ruins, the survivors crawled out and kept living, because that is what people do. Tens of thousands of civilians remained trapped in the city through everything that followed, sheltering in basements and sewer pipes, and their story runs underneath the entire battle. This video will return to them. In early September, the German Sixth Army pushed into the city itself, and Berlin radio prepared the public for an imminent victory announcement. On paper, the announcement looked safe. The Germans held the skies, held the approaches, and were grinding forward toward the river through neighborhoods that no longer had names. Only map squares. The Soviet 62nd Army, its back to the Volga, had been battered down to a strip of riverbank that in places was only a few hundred yards deep. On September 12th, that dying army received a new commander, a blunt, hot-tempered general with a crushing handshake and a peasant's face, ferried across the burning river at night to take charge of what most professionals would have called a lost position. His name was Vasily Chuikov, and the first thing he told his staff was that there was no land for them behind the Volga. Chapter 7. Rattenkrieg, the War of Rats. The Germans had a word for what Stalingrad became that autumn. Rattenkrieg. Rat War. It was not a joke. It was the sound of a professional army discovering that everything it was good at had stopped mattering. Vasily Chuikov understood this before almost anyone else. And that understanding, more than any weapon, is why the 62nd Army survived. Chuikov was not a subtle man. He was a 42-year-old general from a peasant family, physically imposing, famous for his temper, but he had spent the late summer watching how the Germans fought. And in his memoirs he later described the conclusion he drew. The German system was a machine of coordination. Infantry advancing behind dive bombers and artillery. Everything synchronized. Everything at arm's length. So Chuikov ordered his army to break the machine's arms. His soldiers were to stay so close to the German positions, sometimes within grenade-throwing distance, that German pilots and gunners could no longer strike the Soviet line without hitting their own men. He called it hugging the enemy. Consider what that order actually meant for the man receiving it. Safety, such as it was, now lay closer to the enemy, not farther away. The entire instinct of the battlefield was inverted, and it worked, because it dragged the Wehrmacht into the one kind of fight where a half-trained factory militiaman with a submachine gun and knowledge of the local basements was worth as much as a veteran of 3 victorious campaigns. The battle dissolved into thousands of tiny sieges. The unit of measurement at Stalingrad was no longer the mile. It was the floor of a building, the landing of a staircase, the wall between 2 rooms. Soviet defences were built around what Chuikov called storm groups, small teams of perhaps a few dozen men, heavy on grenades, submachine guns, knives, and sharpened spades, who fought at distances where a rifle was almost too long to turn around. Buildings changed hands over and over. The city's main railway station is commonly described in histories of the battle as having changed hands more than a dozen times in a matter of days. German veterans wrote home that they had captured the kitchen but were still fighting for the living room. It reads like dark comedy. The men who wrote it were describing their actual week. Some addresses from that autumn have entered military legend, and 2 are worth knowing by name. The first is the grain elevator, a huge concrete silo complex near the southern edge of the city. In mid-September, a garrison of a few dozen Soviet soldiers, the exact number is uncertain and accounts differ, held that building for days against repeated assaults supported by tanks, while smoke from burning grain filled the stairwells and the defenders ran short of water and ammunition. The Germans took it in the end. What matters is the price and the precedent. A handful of men in one strong building had held up an army's advance, and both sides took note of the math. The second address became the most famous house of the Second World War. In late September, a Soviet platoon seized a 4-story apartment building overlooking a large square roughly a kilometre from the river. Command of the position passed to a junior sergeant named Yakov Pavlov, and the building held, under constant attack, for nearly 2 months, defended by a garrison that rarely numbered much more than a couple of dozen men, a mixed group of Russians, Ukrainians, Georgians, and other Soviet nationalities. They mined the approaches, knocked holes between walls and floors so they could move without stepping outside, and met each assault with fire from a different window, Chuikov later wrote, with a general's flair for the memorable line, that the Germans lost more men trying to take Pavlov's house than they lost taking Paris. That comparison was rhetoric, not accounting, but the fact that it was even plausible tells you what this battle had become. In 1940, France, one of the world's great powers, fell to Germany in 6 weeks. In 1942, one apartment building on the Volga did not fall in 8. Then there were the snipers. The ruins were a sniper's paradise, and Soviet command deliberately cultivated a sniper movement, publicizing champions, the way peacetime newspapers publicized athletes. The most famous name was Vasily Zaitsev, a former shepherd from the Ural foothills, credited by Soviet sources with well over 200 kills at Stalingrad. His celebrated duel with a German master sniper became one of the battle's great stories. And, it has to be said, one of its most disputed, since the tale rests almost entirely on Soviet accounts, including Zaitsev's own memoirs, and many historians doubt the German officer involved ever existed. What is not in doubt is the terror the snipers imposed. In sniper country, a man who stood still for 10 seconds was volunteering. Through October, the fighting concentrated in the industrial north, in the 3 giant factories whose names now read like battle honours, the tractor plant, where workers had been driving tanks, sometimes unpainted and unfinished, straight from the assembly line into combat. Red October, barricade. The Germans took most of the factory district in October, at a cost in casualties they could not replace. In fighting that German survivors' accounts describe as the most horrific of the entire war. Workshops the size of cathedrals, floored with slag and broken machinery, were attacked and counterattacked until, in places along the riverbank, the Soviet toehold was reduced to strips of ground, only dozens to a few hundred yards deep. Behind everything, always, was the river. Every bullet, every loaf, every replacement soldier for the 62nd Army came across the Volga at night, on ferries and barges under German shell fire, and the wounded went back the other way. Ahead of the new men lay a city on fire. Behind them, by Stalin's order and Chuikov's arithmetic, lay nothing at all. By the middle of November, the German Sixth Army held perhaps 90% of the city and had bled itself white to get it. Paulus's divisions were exhausted, under strength, and concentrated inside the ruins, while the long open flanks behind them, out on the snow-covered steppe, were held by allied Romanian armies, brave enough men, but under-equipped, spread thin, and short of everything needed to stop tanks. The Germans knew their maps showed a salient. What they did not know was that for 2 months, in strict secrecy, the Soviet General Staff had been studying those same Romanian sectors the way a chess player studies an undefended file. On the morning of November 19th, in freezing fog on the steppe northwest of the city, Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire at once. The Rat War was about to become an encirclement. Chapter 8. The Volga Lifeline. There is a photograph taken at a Stalingrad river crossing in the autumn of 1942. It shows a barge packed shoulder to shoulder with soldiers, low in the water, moving toward a shoreline where the entire horizon is smoke. No one in the picture is talking. There was nothing to say and nowhere to take cover. The only job was to arrive. Before we watch the trap close on the steppe, we need to stay with that image for a chapter, because there is a version of Stalingrad that the arrows on the maps never show. The Rat War you have just seen was only sustainable because of what happened every night on a stretch of dark water less than a mile wide, and it was endured, from beginning to end, by tens of thousands of people who never wore a uniform at all. Start with the river, because everything at Stalingrad started with the river. The position of the 62nd Army broke every rule in the military textbook. Armies are taught never to fight with an impassable obstacle at their backs, and Chuikov's men fought for months with the greatest river in Europe at theirs. The Volga was their prison wall and their only door at the same time. Every man, every shell, every sack of bread that reached the defenders came across that water, and every wounded soldier with any chance of living had to go back across it. There was no other way in and no other way out. The Germans understood this perfectly, which is why the crossings became one of the most dangerous commutes of the entire war. The Volga military flotilla, along with a fleet of requisitioned civilian ferries, fishing boats, tugs, and barges, ran the river mostly at night, steering by burning buildings, under artillery fire that German gunners had pre-registered on the landing stages. Historians of the battle credit these boat crews, many of them civilian rivermen, with carrying hundreds of thousands of people across the water over the course of the fighting, soldiers going west into the fire, wounded men and evacuees coming east out of it. Chaikhov was blunt about the debt, writing in his memoirs that if the crossings had failed, his army would have failed with them, and in November, the river itself turned against them. The Volga began to freeze, but not solidly, not at first. For weeks it ran with drifting ice floes too thick for boats to push through reliably and too thin to walk on. The crossings all but stopped, and the 62nd Army, at the most desperate point of the battle, was nearly cut off from its own side of the war. Chuikov's memoirs record his fear during those weeks in stark terms. His army could count its reserves in companies, and the door behind it had frozen half shut. Now turn from the river to the people the arrows never show. When the battle began, evacuation had barely started, and the exact numbers will never be known with certainty. What historians broadly agree on is that a very large civilian population, likely numbering in the tens of thousands, remained trapped in the city through the entire battle. They lived in cellars, in sewer pipes, in trenches dug into the river bluffs, in the same ruins the armies were fighting through. They emerged at night to strip flour from bombed warehouses, to cut meat from dead horses, to draw water from the Volga under fire, because the water mains had died with the city. The Soviet writer Vasily Grossman, who reported from inside Stalingrad during the fighting and whose notebooks are among the most trusted eyewitness sources of the battle, recorded the surreal collisions of that underground life. Children playing in trenches a few hundred yards from the front, an old woman carrying a samovar through streets where snipers worked, families keeping goats alive in basements beneath artillery duels. Grossman's conclusion, written at the time, was that ordinary life does not stop in war. It bends, it goes underground, but it refuses to stop. No one has ever described civilian Stalingrad better in a single thought. Understand also who was doing much of the work of survival. With the men at the front, the city within the city ran to a remarkable degree on women. Women crewed the anti-aircraft batteries, as the German tank crews had discovered on the first day. Women served as nurses who crawled into open ground to drag wounded men to cover, as ferry crew, as telephone operators keeping the army's nervous system alive in cellars, and in the factories, as welders and fitters repairing tanks within earshot of the fighting. The Soviet Union mobilized women into its war effort on a scale no other combatant matched. Around 800,000 served in its armed forces during the war, and at Stalingrad that fact was not a statistic. It was the texture of every basement and every crossing. Civilian suffering, however, did not come only from German bombs. Soviet authorities had restricted evacuation early on, and workers were held at their factory benches under wartime discipline while the front crawled toward them. On the German side of the line, occupation meant forced labor, and thousands of civilians from the city and the surrounding region were deported west for work in Germany, a fact documented in both German records and post-war Soviet investigations. Between the two armies, the people of Stalingrad were not bystanders to the battle. They were its raw material. By the time the snow settled in for good, the city had become a place of shadows, a population living beneath the ground while two empires hammered each other above. Far out on the steppe, beyond the frozen horizon, something enormous was assembling in silence. The people in the basements could not know it, neither could the Germans. Chapter 9. Operation Uranus. In September of 1942, while the grain elevator was still burning, two Soviet generals stood in Stalin's office in Moscow with a map and an idea. The generals were Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, and the idea, stripped to one sentence, was this: Stalingrad did not need to be saved inside Stalingrad. Follow the logic, because it is a calculation of extraordinary strategic patience. Every week, the German Sixth Army fed more of its strength into the ruins, where the rat war consumed veteran infantry faster than Germany could train replacements. And every week, the long flanks that protected the German rear, stretching for hundreds of miles across open steppe, northwest and south of the city, were left in the hands of Germany's allies, chiefly the 3rd and 4th Romanian armies. The Romanian soldiers were not cowards, and it matters to say so, because the lazy version of this story insults them. They were catastrophically under-equipped, holding frontages far wider than military doctrine allowed, critically short of modern anti-tank guns, with almost no reserves behind them. Everyone in the German command structure knew these flanks were weak. The assumption in Berlin, stated repeatedly that autumn, was that the Red Army was too exhausted to do anything about it. That assumption was the entire foundation of the German position, and it was wrong. The plan Zhukov and Vasilevsky brought Stalin was built directly on the German assumption: hold the city with the absolute minimum, feed Chuikov just enough to keep the fire burning and the Sixth Army's face pressed against the Volga. Meanwhile, in total secrecy, assemble fresh armies far behind the flanks, then break through the Romanian sectors on both sides of the salient at once, driving 2 armoured pincers across the steppe to meet behind the Germans. The code name was Uranus. The deception effort wrapped around it, the Russians call this discipline maskirovka, was as important as the tanks. Reinforcements moved only at night and hid by day. Radio traffic was choreographed to suggest the next big Soviet effort would come hundreds of miles away. near Moscow, and a genuine offensive was prepared there partly to feed that impression. False concentrations were staged, real ones buried. German intelligence did detect some build-up, and some German and Romanian officers raised alarms. But the picture assembled in Berlin remained fatally comfortable, a limited local attack at most. Across the fronts assigned to the wider operation, Soviet strength exceeded 1 million men, with thousands of guns and hundreds of tanks massed opposite the two chosen breakthrough sectors. That this could be gathered within marching distance of the German army and still come as a surprise makes Uranus one of the best-kept operational secrets of the war, and its non-discovery one of the great intelligence failures of the century. Hold both images in your mind at once. Inside the city, Chaikov's men are clinging to strips of riverbank dozens of yards deep, and every German report says the Soviets are finished. Out on the steppe, in the fog and the frost, the whole tank armies are sitting in bulkers. The deep ravines that vein that country, engines cold, radios silent, waiting. The Germans were winning the battle they could see, and were dangerously close to losing the one they could not. At around 7:20 in the morning on November 19th, 1942, northwest of Stalingrad, thousands of Soviet guns and rocket launchers opened fire together in freezing fog. A bombardment so heavy that the date is still marked in Russia as the holiday of the artillery. Then the tanks came out of the ravines. The Third Romanian Army fought, in places hard, but a line that thin that, short of anti-tank weapons, could not hold against massed armour. And by afternoon, the front northwest of Stalingrad had a hole in it dozens of miles wide. A day later, on November 20th, the second pincer erupted from the lake country south of the city, straight through the Fourth Romanian Army, and turned northwest. What followed was the fast, open, armoured warfare the Germans had invented, executed against them by the student they had spent a year teaching. Soviet tank columns raced through snow across the same steppe the panzers had crossed in August, aiming for a single point deep in the German rear, the town of Kalach, where the main bridge over the Don carried virtually all of the Sixth Army's supplies. On November 22nd, in a detail that sounds invented but is documented in the histories of the operation, a Soviet detachment approached the Kalach bridge with captured German vehicles at the head of the column, and the guards realized what was happening too late. The bridge was taken intact. The next day, November 23rd, near the village of Savetsky southeast of Kalach, the two pincers met, soldiers of the two Soviet fronts, spotting each other across the snow, fired signal flares, and accounts described tank crews embracing on the steppe. The ring had closed. It had taken 4 days. Inside that ring, in the ruins of the city they had spent 3 months and 100,000 casualties conquering, stood the entire German Sixth Army and part of the Fourth Panzer Army, along with Romanian, Croatian, and other Allied units. Somewhere between 250 and 300,000 men, by most historical estimates, cut off in the middle of hostile country, at the start of a Russian winter, with supplies for a matter of days. In Berlin, Hitler faced the decision that would decide all of their lives. The Sixth Army's commanders wanted to break out toward the west immediately, while the Soviet ring was still thin. Hitler said no. The army would stand fast, hold what he was now calling Fortress Stalingrad, and be supplied by air, because the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, had assured him it could be done. Nearly 300,000 men were now betting their lives on that promise. The Germans trapped inside the ring gave their new world a name that needs no translation. They called it Der Kessel, the Cauldron. Chapter 10. The Cauldron. Hermann Göring's promise had a number attached to it, and the number decided everything that followed. The Sixth Army calculated that survival inside the ring required a minimum of around 500 tons of supplies flown in every day, and even that figure assumed short rations. Luftwaffe, transport officers, the men who actually knew what their aircraft could do, protested immediately that no such figure was achievable with the planes available in winter weather. Into a shrinking pocket ringed by Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns. They were overruled. Göring had given his word to Hitler. And inside the Third Reich, the physics of aviation ranked below the vanity of its second most powerful man. The airlift failed from the first week, and it never recovered. On its best days, the operation landed a few hundred tons. On many days, when blizzards grounded the transports or Soviet fighters savaged the formations, it delivered almost nothing, averaged across the siege. The deliveries came to a fraction of the minimum requirement, and the Luftwaffe destroyed itself in the attempt, losing close to 500 transport and bomber aircraft, along with irreplaceable instructor crews pulled from its training schools. Germany's air transport arm never recovered from Stalingrad for the rest of the war. Inside the Cauldron, the consequences arrived in a precise, terrible order. First the bread ration was cut, then cut again, falling step by step until soldiers were receiving a few slices of bread a day. Soup boiled from horse bones, and little else. The army ate its own draft horses, tens of thousands of them. Then came the cold, with temperatures dropping toward -20 and -30 degrees Celsius, far below 0 Fahrenheit, against which the Sixth Army, dressed for a summer campaign that was supposed to have ended in October, had almost nothing. Then came the diseases of starvation and filth, typhus, dysentery, jaundice. German army doctors inside the pocket began recording a phenomenon that frightened them professionally. Soldiers with no visible wounds, lying down and dying, and their reports, preserved in the military archives, attributed it to cold, exhaustion, and hunger simply switching men off. There was one genuine attempt at rescue, and its failure sealed the pocket's fate. In mid-December, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most respected operational commanders, launched a relief offensive, code-named Winter Storm. Driving from the southwest toward the encirclement, his panzers fought to within roughly 30 miles of the ring, close enough that at night men of the Sixth Army could see the flicker of the relief force's guns on the horizon. 30 miles. For an army with fuel and strength, a hard march of 2 or 3 days. Here the story reaches one of its darkest decision points. For the trapped army to be saved, it almost certainly had to break out toward Manstein, abandoning the city. And that required 2 things: Hitler's permission and the physical means to move. Hitler refused to authorize abandoning Stalingrad. Paulus, for his part, reported that his tanks had fuel for barely 20 miles, and his starving infantry could not make an attack across the frozen steppe. Historians have argued for 80 years about how much blame belongs to Hitler's obsession and how much to Paulus's rigidity, and this video will not pretend that argument is settled. What is settled is the outcome. The breakout never came. In late December, a renewed Soviet offensive drove Manstein's spearheads back, and the flickering guns on the horizon went out. Every man in the Cauldron with a map and a working mind now understood what had been decided. The Soviets understood too. In early January, Soviet commanders sent envoys under a white flag offering surrender terms: food for the starving, care for the wounded, repatriation after the war. On Hitler's orders, the offer was refused. What followed was called Operation Ring, the methodical crushing of the pocket, as Soviet armies drove in from the west while the pocket's airfields fell one by one. The loss of the last major airfields in mid and late January ended even the starvation-level airlift, and with it went the last flights carrying wounded men out. Witnesses at those final airstrips described scenes that stayed with them for life. Thousands of wounded and desperate men mobbing the last aircraft, some clinging to the outside of the machines as they lifted into the dark. By the end of January, the pocket had been split in two, and the end came with a piece of theatre so cold it still astonishes. On January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. The promotion was widely understood, on both sides, as a message rather than an honour, because no German Field Marshal in history had ever been taken alive. It was an invitation to suicide. Paulus, sheltering in the basement of the ruined Univermag department store in the city centre, declined the hint, reportedly telling his staff he had no intention of shooting himself for that Bohemian corporal. On the morning of January 31st, Soviet soldiers reached the department store, and the newest field marshal in the German army surrendered in its basement, the scene where this video began. The northern pocket, centered on the tractor factory district, held out 2 days longer. On February 2nd, 1943, its guns went silent, and the Battle of Stalingrad was over. Roughly 91,000 men, the frozen, starving remnant of an army that had numbered around 300,000 when the ring closed, marched into Soviet captivity. Among them Paulus and over 20 other generals. What happened to those 91,000 is the last cruelty of the story. Marched through the winter to camps, ravaged by the typhus and starvation they carried with them, worked as forced labour in the years that followed. They died in numbers that are hard to comprehend. By the figures most commonly cited by historians, only around 5,000 to 6,000 of them ever returned to Germany. The last of them not until 1955, 10 years after the war ended. In Berlin, the regime that had refused every surrender now had to explain the silence on the Volga. German radio announced the annihilation of the Sixth Army and declared days of national mourning. And for the first time in the history of the Third Reich, the state admitted openly to its people that it had suffered a catastrophe. Something changed in Germany in those first days of February, something documented in the regime's own secret morale reports, which recorded a population speaking, for the first time, about the possibility that the war could be lost. To understand whether they were right, and what this one ruined city actually changed, we need to step back from the basement and look at the whole board. Chapter 11. The Hinge of the War. The title of this video makes a claim. It says this battle broke Hitler and changed everything, a claim that large should not be allowed to slide by on drama alone. So let us test it honestly, piece by piece. Start with the raw arithmetic, because in a war of attrition the arithmetic is the argument. In the roughly 6 months of the Stalingrad campaign, from the summer advance to the February surrender, the Axis powers lost somewhere in the region of 800,000 men killed, wounded, missing, and captured by the ranges most Western historians cite. Germany lost an entire field army, its best equipped and among its most experienced, plus the gutting of 2 Romanian armies. an Italian army, and a Hungarian army along the Don. Defeats that effectively knocked the main armies of Germany's allies out of the Eastern Front. Soviet losses were even higher, likely over 1 million casualties across the campaign, and it is a permanent moral fact of the Second World War that the side that won Stalingrad paid more for it than the side that lost. The difference was that the Soviet Union, with its deeper manpower and its factories beyond the Urals now outproducing Germany in tanks and guns, could pay that price and keep fighting. Germany could not. The Sixth Army was replaceable on paper. The veterans inside it, the junior officers and sergeants trained by 3 years of victory, were not. Now look at the strategic ledger, which is even more lopsided. Case Blue existed to win Germany the oil of the Caucasus, without which, by Hitler's own stated reasoning, Germany could not sustain the war. Stalingrad did not merely fail to deliver that oil. Its collapse forced the entire German army group in the Caucasus to retreat hundreds of miles in emergency conditions to avoid being cut off in turn, abandoning the oil fields Germany had briefly touched. The 1942 campaign, Germany's last great bid for a war-winning resource, ended with Germany holding none of the oil, minus an army, and defending a line pushed back toward where it started. After Stalingrad, Germany never again launched an eastern offensive on the scale, or with the war-winning ambition of Case Blue. There would be one more great attack, at Kursk in the summer of 1943, but its goals were already limited: to straighten a line and bleed the Red Army. And when it failed after barely 2 weeks, the initiative in the East passed to the Soviet Union for good. Germany would still counterattack, sometimes brilliantly, as at Kharkov in early 1943, but from Stalingrad onward, the overall direction of the Eastern Front moved one way, westward, toward Berlin. Then there is the ledger that cannot be counted in divisions, the one inside people's heads, inside Germany. The regime's own secret opinion monitoring recorded the shockwave. A population that had been promised the city was already taken now, listening to funeral music on the radio. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht, already dented outside Moscow, was publicly broken, and it was broken by the Reich's own admission. In the occupied countries, the news travelled like electric current, and historians of the occupation record a measurable stiffening of resistance activity in 1943 among Germany's allies and the neutral capitals: Turkey, Sweden, Spain. Governments that had been hedging toward Berlin began quietly hedging the other way, even inside the German officer corps. The conspiracy that would eventually try to kill Hitler in July 1944 drew new recruits from men for whom Stalingrad was the proof that the dictator's leadership meant Germany's destruction. And what did it look like from the country this video is mostly speaking to? In the American winter of 1942 and 43, the war against Germany was still mostly being fought by other people, and Americans followed the fight on the Volga through their newspapers with something close to awe. When the surrender came, it shared front pages with the American victory unfolding at Guadalcanal, and commentators noticed the pairing, the tide visibly turning at both ends of the world in the same weeks. Time magazine had already named Joseph Stalin its Man of the Year for 1942, citing the Soviet stand. For one strange year, the name Stalingrad was a byword for heroism in the American press, in newsreels, in Hollywood, a warmth toward the Soviet Union that would look almost unbelievable 5 years later, when the Cold War froze it out of memory. One object captures that vanished moment better than any statistic. In 1943, King George VI of the United Kingdom commissioned a ceremonial longsword, 4 feet of Sheffield steel with a grip of gold wire, inscribed to the steel-hearted citizens of Stalingrad as a gift from the British people. At the Tehran conference that November, Winston Churchill personally presented the sword of Stalingrad to Stalin, who by most accounts kissed the scabbard, while Franklin Roosevelt looked on. Picture that scene for a moment. The King of England forging a sword of homage for a communist dictator's namesake city. Nations do not do such things for ordinary battles. So, did Stalingrad break Hitler and change everything? Here is the careful answer. Because good history does not deal in single magic turning points. The war against Nazi Germany was won by a combination that no one battle can claim alone. Soviet blood and space, American industry, British persistence, the air war, the Atlantic. Some historians place the true point of no return earlier, in front of Moscow in December 1941, when the quick war Germany needed died forever. Others point to the sheer arithmetic of production that made Germany's defeat likely from the moment the United States entered the war. But ask a slightly different question. Not when was the war decided, but when did people begin to know? And there the evidence converges on the frozen basement of a department store on the Volga, before Stalingrad. Germany's ultimate defeat was a projection, an argument, a hope. After Stalingrad, it became the working assumption of Allied planners, of a growing number of German generals, of resistance fighters across Europe, and, as his own recorded remarks from the period suggest, of a shaken Adolf Hitler himself. For many observers on every side, the question of the war changed in February 1943, from who will win to how long until Germany loses. The war lasted 27 more months, and more people died in them than in all the months before. But it was, from that winter on, a different war. The world's attention, having watched the city die, now moved on with the front line, west toward Kursk, toward Normandy, toward Berlin. The cameras left, the correspondents left, and behind them, on the west bank of the Volga, in temperatures still far below freezing, roughly 10,000 civilian survivors climbed out of the basements of a destroyed city. I looked around at the place where 500,000 people had lived a year earlier, and began, with their bare hands, to take it back. Chapter 12. A city rebuilt from zero. In the spring of 1943, Soviet planners toured what was left of Stalingrad, and the scale of the destruction was so complete that it prompted serious discussion about whether rebuilding on the same site made economic sense at all, or whether it would be cheaper to start a new city somewhere else on the Volga. The reasoning behind that discussion was grimly simple. By the estimates compiled after the battle, the overwhelming majority of the city's housing stock, over 90% by most accounts, was destroyed or uninhabitable. Of the tens of thousands of buildings that had stood in August 1942, only a few hundred remained in usable condition. The water system was gone. The power system was gone. The tram lines were twisted wreckage. And underneath everything lay the battle itself. The rubble was saturated with unexploded shells, bombs, min, and grenadiers, and with the dead of 2 armies, so many that in some districts the spring thaw made whole neighbourhoods unlivable. Rebuilding here would not be construction. It would be archaeology through a minefield. The city was rebuilt where it stood anyway. And be honest about why. The city that carried Stalin's name, the city where the war had turned, could not be quietly written off like a bankrupt asset. The symbol was now worth more than the arithmetic. And for once in this story, the ego-driven decision and the humane one pointed the same direction, because roughly 10,000 civilians had survived in the ruins, and thousands more began returning within weeks to a city that officials had told them was not ready. They came anyway. It was home. What happened next deserves to be far better known than it is, because it is one of the great reconstruction stories of the 20th century, and its heroes were mostly women with shovels. In June 1943, a kindergarten teacher named Alexandra Cherkasova organized a volunteer brigade of women, working after their regular shifts, to restore a famous ruin. The building Pavlov's garrison had defended during the battle. The idea spread with astonishing speed, and the Cherkasova movement, as it became known across the Soviet Union, grew into tens of thousands of volunteers in Stalingrad alone, clearing rubble, stacking salvageable bricks, and rebuilding by hand in the hours after their paid work ended. Add to the picture the fact that the returning population was overwhelmingly female, the men being dead, disabled, or still at the front, and you get the true image of Stalingrad's second act. The city that soldiers had defended was resurrected, brick by brick, largely by its women, often while they lived in the basements and dugouts of the battlefield itself. German prisoners of war also laboured on the reconstruction for years, a detail Soviet accounts rarely advertised. The sight of men of the Sixth Army rebuilding what their army had destroyed was, depending on where you stood, justice or tragedy or both. The pace was ferocious. The tractor factory, the ruin where the Northern Pocket had made its last stand in February, was repairing tanks within months and shipped its first new tractors before the war ended. Red October poured steel again in 1943. The city was declared a priority of the post-war 5-year plan, and money, materials, and planners poured in, because the old city was effectively a blank page. The planners dreamed big. The new Stalingrad was laid out as a showcase, with broad avenues, monumental stone apartment blocks in the wedding cake style of the era, parks, embankments, and a grand riverfront staircase descending to the Volga, the city presenting itself to the river like a stage set. In 1952, the Volga-Don Canal opened just south of the city, finally joining the two rivers whose 40-mile separation had defined this place since 1589. The dream that had justified the fortress of the Tsars was completed, with grim historical symmetry, partly by the forced labour of prisoners, in the name of the man the city was named for. By the mid-1950s, a visitor to the rebuilt centre could see surprisingly little of the destruction that had defined the city only a decade earlier. The population passed its pre-war level and kept climbing. The showcase was complete. And then, in 1961, the name came off. To understand why, you need one scene from Moscow. Stalin died in March 1953, and 3 years later, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, stood before a closed session of the party congress and delivered the so-called secret speech, a detailed denunciation of Stalin's terror, his cult of personality, and his wartime blunders. The de-Stalinization that followed moved slowly at first. Then all at once, in 1961, Stalin's body was removed from the mausoleum on Red Square, where it had lain beside Lenin. And in November of that year, by decree, the city of Stalingrad became Volgograd, the city of the Volga. Sit with the irony for a moment, because there is little else like it in modern history. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers had died in a battle the whole world knew by this city's name. The name itself had become one of the most famous words to come out of the Second World War, and barely 18 years after the victory, the Soviet state erased that word from the map, not because of anything the city had done, but because the man it honoured had become an embarrassment. Catherine the Great had renamed a river to erase Pugachev. The party had renamed Tsaritsyn to exalt a rising dictator. Now the state renamed Stalingrad to bury a fallen one. 3 times. A Russian government reached for the map to edit the past. And 3 times. This city was the page it wrote on. The renaming created a paradox. The city still lives inside. The battle is called Stalingrad. The city is called Volgograd. The place and its most famous moment no longer share a name. And every monument, every anniversary, every history book has had to navigate that gap ever since. A city can rebuild its buildings with bricks and volunteers, but how does it rebuild the memory of 1 million dead? The answer Volgograd gave rises nearly 300 feet above the city, on the hill where some of the worst of the fighting happened. Chapter 13. The Motherland Calls. Every city in this series holds its memory somewhere. Paris holds it in stone plaques and an eternal flame. Hiroshima holds it in a skeletal dome and a park of lanterns. Volgograd holds its memory on a hill, and within that hill lie the dead of the battle itself. The locals call it Mamayev Kurgan, and during the battle the military maps called it simply Height 102, for its elevation in meters. It is not much of a hill by any normal standard. A long grassy rise above the river in the middle of the city. But in the Rat War of 1942 it was priceless, because whoever held its crest could observe and direct fire across the city centre, the factory district, and the vital Volga crossings. So both armies fought for it, continuously, for months. The summit changed hands over and over, and by the winter the hill had been so churned by shell fire that accounts from the following spring describe slopes where grass would not grow, soil fused with iron fragments, and snow that had fallen grey. Soviet sources estimate that the remains of tens of thousands of soldiers lie buried within the memorial hill, most never individually identified. When the city chose this place for its great memorial, it was not choosing a scenic overlook, it was crowning a tomb. The memorial complex that rose on Mamayev Kurgan between 1959 and 1967 was designed by the sculptor Yevgeny Vuchetich, and it is best experienced the way its designers intended. As a climb, you ascend from the city on a long axis of staircases and terraces, past a sculpture of a bare-chested soldier rising out of living rock, past ruined walls carved with the faces and recorded radio phrases of the defenders, past a reflecting pool called the Square of Heroes, lined with giant figures representing the forms of sacrifice associated with the battle. A soldier carrying a wounded comrade, a woman bearing a dying son. Then you enter a circular hall where an enormous sculpted hand holds an eternal flame, and an honor guard stands over walls carrying the names of thousands of the fallen, with quiet music playing, and then you step out of the hall, onto the crest, and you look up. She is called the Motherland Calls, and there is very little else like her anywhere on earth. A woman in wind-whipped robes, striding forward, mouth open in a shout, sword raised to the sky, calling her children to battle. From her feet to the tip of the sword, she stands roughly 280 feet tall, which made her, at her completion in 1967, the tallest statue in the world. For the American viewers, this video is made for one comparison says it all. The Statue of Liberty. from her feet to the tip of her torch, is about 150 feet. The Motherland calls is nearly twice that, and unlike Liberty, she stands on no colossal pedestal, just the low mound of the hill, so that she seems to have risen out of the grave soil herself. She is built of concrete, held taut by hundreds of internal steel cables, and she has been the object of decades of careful engineering monitoring, because a statue that size, on a hill full of the dead, in the wind off the Volga, is a permanent argument with physics. Stand at her feet and you understand what the Soviet Union was saying. Liberty lifts a torch, an invitation. The Motherland lifts a sword, a summons. One statue welcomes you to a new life. The other commands you to defend an old one to the death. You do not need to read a word of Russian to receive the message. And that is exactly the point. The men who built her were building for centuries. But memory of Stalingrad has never been one single thing. And it has never been politically innocent. Inside Russia, the battle became the sacred center of what is officially called the Great Patriotic War, the version of the Second World War that begins in 1941 and centers, understandably, on Soviet suffering and Soviet victory. That cult of memory is genuinely felt, tended by families who lost someone, which in this country means nearly every family. It has also, in every period from Brezhnev to the present, been an instrument of the state, a source of legitimacy that governments in Moscow have drawn on whenever they needed the people's loyalty. The city itself reflects the tension, since 2013, by local decision. Volgograd officially calls itself Stalingrad again on a handful of commemorative days each year, including February 2nd, the anniversary of the victory. It is a compromise between memory and history that satisfies almost no one completely, and probably cannot be improved on. In Germany, Stalingrad became the opposite kind of memory, the great national trauma of the war in the East, the word every German family of that generation knew. For decades, West German memory dwelled on the suffering of the encircled Sixth Army, the frozen letters home, the betrayal of the men by Hitler and Göring. Historians have noted how much easier that story was to tell than the other documented story. What that same army had participated in on its march east through a landscape of atrocity. German memory of Stalingrad has spent 80 years slowly, painfully widening to hold both truths at once. And beyond both countries, near the city, there is one quiet place that may say more than the statue does. At Rossoshka, joint efforts by Russian and German organizations maintain adjoining war cemeteries where soldiers of both armies lie, gathered over decades from the steppe where they fell, tens of thousands of names, many stones marking men never identified, Russian and German dead, within sight of each other, tended together. It took about half a century after the battle for such a place to become possible. Some kinds of peace can only be made by the generation that did not fight. The Motherland's sword has stood against the sky for almost 60 years now. Beneath her, the city has gone on living, changing, arguing about its own name, raising generations for whom the battle is not memory but inheritance. Which leaves the last question this story has to answer. After the fortress, after the boomtown, after the battle, after the rebuilding, what is this place now? Chapter 14. Volgograd today. Fly into the city today and the name games begin before you land. In April of 2025, by presidential decree, following a campaign by veterans groups, the city's international airport was officially given the historic name Stalingrad. The city is Volgograd. The airport is Stalingrad, A traveller arrives at a name the map gave up in 1961, then takes a taxi into a city that has so far declined to take it back. There may be no better single image of how unfinished this story still is. The Volgograd of the 2020s is a city of roughly 1 million people, stretched in that same improbable ribbon along the West Bank, an unusually long and narrow city even by the standards of river cities, some 50 miles of riverfront, and rarely more than a handful of miles deep. The geography that started everything still runs the place. The Volga-Don Canal still carries ships between the two river worlds. The great dam and hydroelectric station north of the city, finished in the post-war decades, still power the region. The successors of Red October still work metal. It is, by honest description, a hard-working provincial industrial city, wealthier in history than in income, the kind of place young people often leave for Moscow, which may be the most universal city story of all. And the battle is everywhere, because this is one of the most intensely memorialized urban battlefields in the world. The Motherland calls from her hill above the traffic. The ruined mill, left unrestored since 1943, stands deliberately broken beside the Panorama Museum. The way the bombed church tower stands in Berlin and the dome stands in Hiroshima, a wound kept open on purpose. Pavlov's rebuilt house carries its memorial wall. School children still stand honor guard at the eternal flame, and the ground itself has not finished testifying. Every year, volunteer search teams working the steppe recover the remains of soldiers, identify the few they can from medallions and artifacts, and bury them with honors at Rososhka. Every year, construction crews in the city still occasionally unearth the war. A rusted shell here, a soldier there. In Volgograd, the past is not even past. It is a layer in the soil. The name question, meanwhile, refused to die. And it is worth understanding why. Because it is not really an argument about a word. Periodically, veterans, organizations, and nationalist politicians campaign to rename the whole city Stalingrad permanently. And polls reported over the years have generally suggested most residents prefer to keep Volgograd, though the balance shifts with the political weather. Listen closely, and you hear that the two sides are not actually disagreeing about geography. One side says the name honors the dead of 1942 and nothing else. The other side answers that you cannot restore the dictator's name to the map and pretend it carries only the battle. It is the argument this whole story has been building since 1925. Whether a name can be separated from the man. Whether memory can be kept while its politics are refused. 3 times, governments changed this city's name to control the past. The current compromise, Volgograd for daily life, Stalingrad for a few days of remembrance each year, is the first time the city has tried to hold both answers at once. So what is this place? In the end, step back to where this video began, with a fort of fresh timber on an empty riverbank in 1589, and run the whole story through your hands. A Turkic name on a Russian fortress, Raisin at the gates, and the gates opening, Pugachev at the gates, and the gates holding, the railroad, the timber, the oil, the Chicago of the Volga, a Georgian revolutionary in 1918, and a city renamed for him in 1925. The arrows on the map in 1942, drawn along the same corridor the fortress was built to watch. August 23rd. The Rat War, the house that would not fall. Uranus. The Cauldron, the basement of the department store. 10,000 survivors climbing out of the ground. Women rebuilding a city with their hands after their shifts. A name given for one man's glory and taken away for the same man's disgrace. A concrete woman with a sword, standing on a hill of soldiers. Every city in this series survives by some particular gift. Paris survives by reinventing itself, becoming a new city on the same river again and again. Hiroshima survives by transformation, turning the worst morning in its history into an argument for peace. Volgograd's gift is harder and plainer, and it may be the oldest one there is. This city endures. It was built to stand on dangerous ground, and it has been attacked, starved, renamed, obliterated, and rebuilt, and it is still there, doing what it was founded to do in 1589, holding the bend in the river where two worlds meet. The trams run along the riverbank in the summer evenings. Families walk the embankment where the ferries once crossed under fire. Fishermen stand in the shallows below the bluffs the 62nd Army held. And above them all, from the hill that holds the fallen, the motherland still calls. Sword against the sky, over a city that has carried 3 names and outlived every power that named it. The river that started everything just keeps moving south, the way it did in 1589, the way it did in 1943, the way it will long after every argument about the name is forgotten. Cities, in the end, belong to their rivers, and the Volga has never once let this one go.